It started like any other school day in the small town of Ravenswood, Indiana. On the morning of September 14, 1998, a group of 26 students and their teacher arrived at Crestwood Elementary for what should have been a normal day of learning. The children, all between the ages of 7 and 9, had just settled into their classroom when, sometime before lunch, they vanished without a trace. When the first reports came in, parents rushed to the school in panic. Teachers, janitors, and the principal combed the entire building, but there was no sign of the students or their teacher. The authorities were baffled. The classroom itself was in perfect order. Desks were neatly arranged, backpacks were still hung on hooks, and even lunches remained untouched. There was no sign of forced entry or struggle. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. A massive search effort followed. Police and FBI agents scoured the school, the surrounding neighborhood, and the nearby woods. Helicopters flew overhead, while divers searched the town's lake. Every lead led to a dead end. Surveillance footage showed nothing unusual, just a static image of the empty classroom at the time they were last seen. The town of Ravenswood was left in a state of horror, grief, and confusion. Parents moved away. The school eventually shut down, and the case faded into urban legend. For 27 years, the mystery remained unsolved. Families of the missing children mourned in silence, never getting the closure they so desperately needed. But in 2025, everything changed when a woman named Sarah Callahan, the mother of one of the missing children, made a shocking discovery. She had never stopped searching for answers, spending decades poring over old reports, revisiting the abandoned school, and reaching out to anyone who might have a clue. Then, while going through an old box of belongings, she found forgotten VHS tape, one of the old security recordings from the school. The footage was grainy, but Sarah played it over and over, determined to spot something the investigators might have missed. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The children were sitting at their desks, the teacher writing something on the board. Then, in the blink of an eye, the entire room changed. The desks were still there, but they were covered in dust. The walls had cracks. The clock on the wall was missing, and the sunlight streaming through the windows had a strange, dim quality to it. Most disturbingly, the children and their teacher were no longer in the same positions. They weren't gone, but they looked different. Sarah zoomed in, her heart pounding. The children looked older, their hair longer, their clothes slightly different. Their expressions were frozen in shock, as if they had just realized something was terribly wrong. And then the tape cut to static. Shaken, she brought the tape to the authorities. Investigators used modern forensic technology to enhance the footage, revealing an even more chilling detail. The timestamp on the recording had changed. The original footage was from 1998, but for a split second, the tape showed a different date, March 2025. The children hadn't vanished. They had been displaced, somehow stuck between 2 points in time. The case reopened, drawing national attention. Scientists, physicists, and paranormal researchers swarmed Ravenswood, trying to understand how an entire classroom had seemingly skipped 27 years into the future. Meanwhile, the abandoned school was sealed off, with authorities fearing that whatever had caused the incident could still be present. Then, on March 17, 2025, something unthinkable happened. Crestwood Elementary's long-abandoned front doors swung open on their own. Inside, the classroom that had been untouched for nearly 3 decades was suddenly occupied again. The missing students and their teachers stood inside, dazed and confused, as if no time had passed at all. They had no memory of what had happened. To them, it was still 1998. As their families rushed to the scene, emotions ran high. Parents wept, embracing children who were still 8 years old while they themselves had grown older. The teacher, Miss Grayson, clutched her head, trying to comprehend why her students' parents now looked like elderly strangers. The world they had returned to was not the one they had left. Despite extensive investigations, no one could fully explain the phenomenon. Some believed it was a strange scientific anomaly, a rip in time itself. Others whispered that something more sinister had been at play, a force beyond human comprehension. The only thing everyone agreed on was that it had changed Ravenswood forever. Even now, the town remains haunted by the mystery. Some of the returned students, now adults, claimed to hear strange whispers in their sleep. Others refused to speak of what they might have seen in those lost years. But one thing is certain: 27 years ago, an entire class disappeared, and somehow, against all odds, they came back. In the weeks following the return of the missing class, the world watched as experts scrambled to explain what had happened. News channels flooded Ravenswood, turning the once quiet town into a media circus. Scientists proposed theories of time dilation, quantum entanglement, and even interdimensional shifts, but none could offer concrete proof. Paranormal investigators insisted it was something supernatural, an unexplainable event tied to the school itself. The children, still mentally and physically 8 years old despite having been gone for 27 years, struggled to adjust. Their parents, now middle-aged or elderly, faced the impossible challenge of raising their children again, knowing they themselves were no longer the same. Some parents, like Sarah Callahan, felt nothing but gratitude, but others wrestled with an unsettling reality. While their children had remained frozen in time, they had moved on, had more children, or even lost hope. Reintegrating them into modern life proved almost impossible. Technology alone was a shock to the returned students. Cell phones, self-driving cars, streaming services, none of it made sense to them. The world was no longer the one they knew. Miss Grayson, their teacher, tried to help them adjust, but even she struggled with the overwhelming changes. Unlike the students, she understood what had happened on a deeper level, and the weight of it took a visible toll. Some children spoke of vague memories, but most recounted nothing, except one. A boy named Daniel Reeves, one of the quieter students before the disappearance, began experiencing vivid nightmares. He spoke of a gray space, a void where time didn't exist, and a shadow that watched them waiting. His mother, terrified by his late-night screams, sought medical help, but every doctor found him physically healthy. It was his mind that carried the burden of what had happened. Other students started showing signs of unease as well. Some refused to sleep with the lights off, while others avoided mirrors, claiming they would see something that wasn't supposed to be there. One girl, Emily Hayes, pointed at her reflection one night and whispered, "That's not me." Despite their return, not everything felt whole again. Investigators who revisited the abandoned school reported strange occurrences. Their equipment malfunctioned, voices echoed in empty hallways, and doors slammed without reason. One officer swore he saw a movement in the classroom, the same classroom where the children had vanished. But when he checked, it was empty. The local government decided to demolish the building, hoping to put an end to the mystery once and for all. On the morning of the demolition, however, another eerie event unfolded. As the wrecking crew prepared to tear down the school, all the machinery shut down simultaneously. Workers reported feeling dizzy and disoriented, and some claimed they could hear distant voices. Children's laughter, distorted and echoing. It was enough to make the demolition crew abandon the job. Instead, the school was permanently sealed off, left to rot. As the years passed, the returned students grew up, but they remained different. Some left Ravenswood, seeking a new life, while others stayed, bound by an unspoken connection to what had happened. Daniel Reeves, still plagued by nightmares, eventually became a researcher in theoretical physics, obsessed with understanding the event. Emily Hayes, the girl afraid of mirrors, disappeared on her 21st birthday, her apartment left untouched except for a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It's still watching." No matter how much time passed, one thing remained certain. The mystery of Crestwood Elementary was far from over. Years turned into decades, but the legend of the vanished class never faded. The town of Ravenswood tried to move on, yet whispers of Crestwood Elementary's strange past persisted. Urban explorers sneaked into the abandoned school, only to leave shaken, speaking of cold spots, flickering lights, and the feeling of being watched. Some even claimed to hear faint voices calling their names. Daniel Reeves, now a physicist specializing in temporal anomalies, became obsessed with unraveling what had happened to him and his classmates. He spent years studying theories of time displacement, wormholes, and parallel realities. Though he had no clear memories of where they had been, his nightmares continued to show him glimpses of the gray space. an endless void where time stood still. In his dreams, he saw the classroom suspended in nothingness, his classmates frozen in place while something loomed just beyond his vision. Then, in 2055, exactly 30 years after their return, Daniel made a chilling discovery. Using advanced technology to enhance the old security footage Sarah Callahan had found decades earlier, he noticed something everyone had overlooked. In the last frame before the screen cut to static, a shadowy figure stood in the corner of the classroom, barely visible. It was tall, with elongated limbs, and its head tilted slightly, as if observing the children. No one had been able to see it before, because it existed between frames, only appearing for a fraction of a second. Daniel's heart pounded. Whatever had taken them had been there all along, watching, determined to find answers. He reached out to his old classmates. Some refused to talk, wanting to leave the past buried. Others, like Emily Hayes' younger sister, begged him to stop, fearing that digging too deep might bring back whatever had taken them. Emily's disappearance had shaken them all. Her eerie last note still haunted Daniel's mind. Despite the warnings, Daniel couldn't stop. He returned to Ravenswood, sneaking into the old school one last time. The air was thick with dust and silence. His footsteps echoed through the halls as he made his way to their old classroom. It looked the same as it had the day they disappeared, except for one thing. The desks were covered in fresh handprints. Small handprints. Then, the temperature dropped. A faint whisper filled the air. "Daniel, you were supposed to stay." His breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly toward the door, but it was no longer there. The walls of the classroom stretched endlessly into darkness, the floor beneath him dissolving into nothing. He wasn't in the school anymore. He was back in the gray space. And this time he wasn't alone. The shadow stood before him, its hollow eyes locking onto his. "You left the door open," it murmured, its voice twisting and stretching through the void. "Now we can come through." Outside in the real world, the town of Ravenswood fell silent. Lights flickered, radios turned to static, and clocks stopped ticking. The sky over the abandoned school darkened unnaturally as the first screams echoed from within. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the town went quiet. By morning, the old school had crumbled into ruin, as if it had never been there at all. The town records of Crestwood Elementary vanished. Newspaper archives of the missing class were gone. It was as though the entire event had been erased from history. But for those who remembered, the families of the returned children, the few classmates still alive, and the ones who had always felt that something wasn't right, one thing was certain. Daniel had found the truth, and in doing so, he had let it in. Sarah Callahan was the last thread tying the mystery of Crestwood Elementary to the real world. When she disappeared, it was as if Ravenswood itself began to forget. Newspapers that once held stories of the vanished class suddenly had blank spaces where the articles should have been. Online searches brought up nothing. Even the families of the missing started to question their own memories, as though something was rewriting reality itself. The town moved on, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. But not everyone forgot. Miles away, in a dimly lit basement stacked with old records and case files, a man named Dr. Vincent Holloway sat staring at his computer screen. He was a historian specializing in anomalous disappearances, cases where people vanished under circumstances that defied logic. He had been following the Ravenswood case for years, and now, something disturbing was happening. Every digital record of Crestwood Elementary was erasing itself, not just on the internet, but on his private hard drives, too. Photos became corrupted, documents turned to gibberish. It was as if something was actively undoing the town's history. But Vincent was prepared. He reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a physical file, one of the last untouched pieces of evidence about Crestwood Elementary. Inside was a transcript from an old interview, conducted in 1937, with a former teacher who had worked at the school when it first opened. The man's words were chilling. "The children don't leave. They never leave. We send them home, but they always come back. Different. Wrong. And the ones who try to run, well, the school takes them back, too." Vincent's hands trembled as he turned the page. The final sentence was underlined in red ink. "There is no time in that place. Only waiting." He snapped the file shut. He had read enough. He knew what he had to do. If the town had forgotten, if the records were being erased, if even reality itself was shifting to bury the truth, then someone had to go back. Someone had to pull him out before it was too late. And Vincent Holloway intended to be that someone. On the night of October 31st, 2055, under a blood-red moon, Vincent arrived at the ruins of Crestwood Elementary. The town of Ravenswood was silent. No one came near the old school anymore. Not because they remembered why, but because something deep in their bones told them to stay away. Vincent stepped over broken foundation, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He had spent years preparing for this moment, researching every anomaly, every missing case, every inexplicable event tied to Crestwood. But nothing could prepare him for what he saw next. The ruins were gone. In their place stood the school, perfectly intact, as if it had never been abandoned. The brick walls were clean, the windows unbroken. The front door stood open, inviting. Vincent swallowed hard. He was no fool. He knew a trap when he saw one, but he had come too far to turn back now. Steeling himself, he took a breath and stepped inside. The second he crossed the threshold, the air turned heavy, pressing against his skin like thick water. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, flickering. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, rows of lockers gleaming under the pale glow. Then, from deep within the school, a familiar voice echoed through the halls. "Dr. Holloway?" He froze. It was Sarah Callahan. She sounded close, too close. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice laced with something wrong. Vincent turned a corner and saw her. Sarah stood at the far end of the hallway, wearing the same clothes she had disappeared in, but there was something off about her posture. Too rigid, too still, and her eyes weren't blinking. Vincent's instincts screamed at him to run, but he was here for answers. "Sarah," he called out, "where are the children?" Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Instead, she twitched, a subtle, jerky motion, as though something inside her was struggling to work properly. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, she smiled. "They're waiting for you." Vincent took a step back. Then the hallway lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, dozens of other figures appeared behind her. Small figures. Children, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their arms hanging limply at their sides. Their faces were pale, expressionless, eyes too dark, too hollow. And when the lights flickered again, they were closer, much closer. Vincent's breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. He had to move. But as he turned to flee, Sarah whispered one last thing. "It's too late, Dr. Holloway. The school remembers you now." The doors behind him slammed shut, and the world around him collapsed into the gray.